Hey everyone, it's Victoria and welcome back to my channel. I am so excited that I have been growing my subscribership exponentially over the past few weeks. I am almost at 200 subscribers, and I think once I hit 1,000, I'm gonna have a big celebration with some giveaways. So keep inviting your friends, make sure that you subscribe and like so that you get those updates and that I can keep producing videos. If you are expecting a COVID-19 update, I apologize. I will not be speaking about that topic today. There are plenty of resources that are much better than I am that are covering it right now. I'll link some of them below. But my goal in medical coding has always been and will always be, and I'm certainly not there now, but it is my highest achievement. I want to be sort of the Bill Nye of medical coding. I want to make things light and fun and educational because, you know, my learning experience was basically being read the CPT book. And I just know that we as the medical coding community can do so much better. So I am making that so much better by producing these YouTube videos and having this great content and trying to make it available for free as much as I can. You know, I do have some paid programs on my website at contempocoding.com that if you're interested, such as my risk adjustment coding course, and I will be adding more to that as time goes on. But for now, I just love being able to provide some educational tools to people that are struggling, and I am planning on continuing with just business as usual because someone has to do it. So in today's video, I actually want to cover closure coding. So codes 12001 through 13160 in the CPT book. There wasn't code changes in these for 2020, but there were some guideline changes that I think some people may have missed. So I want to go over those and show you what has changed in the guidelines from 2019 to 2020, and then go over those differences between the simple, intermediate, and complex closure codes. Now first, in order to understand the difference between some of these closure codes, you need to understand your skin anatomy. The top layer of the skin is the epidermis. Underneath that is the dermis, and then the subcutaneous tissue. If we get further than subcutaneous tissue, that's when we start getting into like our fatty adipose tissue or muscle tissue. On the left are the 2020 guidelines, on the right are the 2019 guidelines, and you can see there was a lot added and changed for 2020. All that stuff that's in green text there is our new guidelines, and a lot of it pertained particularly to the differences in intermediate and complex repairs, and includes now actually an image of what qualifies as extensive undermining. In an intermediate closure, it's more than a one-layer closure. So we would do maybe the epidermal or dermal tissue, and as well as the subcutaneous or fascia. It can include a limited amount of undermining. So a limited amount of undermining is defined here as a distance less than the maximum width of the defect measured perpendicular to the closure line along at least one entire edge of the defect. And we'll talk more about that later. Or an intermediate closure can also be one layer closure if you're also doing any kind of extensive cleaning or removing particulate matter. So for example, if you are the patient may be rubbed against the pavement and there's some tiny bits of gravel or stone that have to be debrided out of there and removed and cleaned, but you're just doing a one-layer closure, it could count as intermediate because you're doing the single layer closure and then removing that heavy contamination, all that gravel and pavement and dirt and stuff that's in there. Where we get into our complex repair codes are when we are doing those more than one layer. It would meet all the requirements for an intermediate repair plus some additional stuff. So there would have to be exposure of bone, exposure of cartilage, of tendon, or a named neurovascular structure. So if the provider just says neurovascular, that won't count. He has to name what that structure is. Or if he does debridement of the wound edges, in the examples of traumatic laceration or avulsions, or extensive undermining. So extensive undermining is now defined. Prior to this, it wasn't defined. So now it's defined as a distance greater than or equal to the maximum width of the defect, measured perpendicular to the closure line along at least one entire edge of the defect. Or it could be a layered closure that also involves free margins of helical rim, vermilion border, or nostril rim with placement of retention sutures. So necessary preparation includes the creation of a limited defect for repairs or the debridement of complicated lacerations or avulsions. And it makes a note here, complex repair does not include excision of benign lesions. I'm not going to talk about lesions today. I have a whole other lesion presentation that I'll be putting together and uploading to my site. A Let's Talk Lesions, I call it, and that'll be available for sale soon. Extensive undermining is defined as the distance equal or greater to the maximum width of the defect measured perpendicular to the closure line along at least one entire edge of the defect. Here's our line of closure. Perpendicular to that is 2 centimeters. So our undermining would need to be at least 2 centimeters as well for it to count as extensive undermining, because it says equal or greater than the maximum width of the defect. So our width of our defect here that's perpendicular to this line is 2 centimeters. So we would not need to have at least 2 centimeters for it to count as extensive undermining. One thing I really want to point out as a difference between the 2019 versus our new 2020 guidelines is here in the 2019 version, it lists scar revision under complex closure. That has been eliminated. There is no longer any guidance suggesting that a scar revision will default to a complex repair code. It would still need to meet whatever the requirements are for simple, intermediate, or repair. So that scar revision verbiage has been completely removed for 2020. A common question among coders that are just learning this concept is, what is undermining? So undermining, if you think of like a hole, you have a hole in your body from, a wound of some sort, and the provider goes and sutures it together. When it's a small opening, they can just kind of suture it together just in one layer and it will come together nicely. But when you have a bigger wound, it causes a lot of tension to take that skin and pull it back together again. So what they do is they kind of almost like sweep underneath and release all that extra tissue by kind of horizontally cutting underneath the tissue to release some of that tension and suture it back together without it being at more risk of opening. If you've ever cooked a turkey or a chicken and you've pulled underneath that layer of skin to get rid of all that tension so you could stuff butter or whatever under there, it's like that. It's getting horizontally underneath that tissue. So in the case of undermining, they would be getting out their scalpel and cutting around in order to get less tension on that tissue. There is additional CPT guidance about closure coding in relationship to lesions. I'm actually going to be doing a lesion coding webinar on demand, so you'll be able to get that in a few weeks. So definitely check that out. It will be a paid product. I usually don't charge too much for webinars, so there's going to be a plethora of information about lesions and coding and skin lesions versus musculoskeletal coverage and all that kind of cool stuff. Now, one thing that can trip you up, and this is really actually important for your CPC exam because they like to ask some of these closure coding codes, is the combination of the repairs. So if a repair is done in the same combined anatomic area per CPT, and it's the same type, meaning simple, intermediate, or complex, you can combine the lengths. Meaning that if you have on your arm and trunk, which are combined anatomic areas per CPT, and they're all intermediate repairs, if you have 2 centimeters here and 2 centimeters here, you would code it to a 4 centimeter laceration. So for example, if it is an intermediate repair of the arm and of the trunk, which are grouped into that same classification, it would actually code to code 12032, which is for repair intermediate wounds of the scalp, axilla, trunk, and or extremities of 2.6 centimeters to 7.5 centimeters. You cannot combine codes that are not of the same anatomic areas that are grouped together if they are of different classifications. So if you have a simple repair and a complex repair, even if they're both on the arm, you cannot combine them. One would code to the simple repair of the arm, the other would code to the complex repair of the arm. And you have to be very careful when you're selecting your code because they don't all follow the same structure. So for example, intermediate repairs group together scalp, axilla, trunk, and or extremities, excluding hands and feet. But then the complex repairs have ones that are just trunk. So they don't all follow the same suit. It all has to do with the different complexity and reimbursement for those procedures. So for example, there's a big difference between doing a laceration repair that's 2 centimeters on the arm versus 2 centimeters on your nose or your eyelids. There's a big difference in complexity, in risk, in healing. And that's all attributed for and calculated into, those reimbursements, those RVUs, because of the additional complexity for an eyelid versus an arm. Now, before we start looking at some examples, I am going to need a drink. This is what I've been referring to as my unicorn water. For those of you that know me, I am a huge coffee fanatic and I love my sugar-free syrups in my coffee. And they've released 2 new flavors under skinny syrups. One is unicorn, the other is mermaid, and I had to choose. I'm like, I don't want to buy both at once. So I got the unicorn, and it's kind of like this sweet, almost a little bit of fruity, a little bit of cotton candy. It reminds me of like a snow cone, but you just add just a little bit into my water and it just is so good. So in this case, the patient presents following a bicycle accident and needs suturing. They have 2 lacerations, one on the right forearm, one on the left forearm. You have to be very careful because just because the provider says that the wound was 2 centimeters, that doesn't necessarily mean that they sutured 2 centimeters. That patient, technically speaking, could have a 5 centimeter laceration, but he could have only sutured up 2 centimeters of it. So you can't just go by, he says it was a laceration of 2 centimeters, unless he says, he sutured the full length of the, the laceration or what have you. In this case, patient presents for the 2 centimeter laceration repair on right and 2 centimeter on the left. And down here, he does fully describe the procedure, and he says there was a 2 centimeter closure performed on the right forearm, and there was a simple interrupted sutures in the dermal layer. So this supports our 1-layer closure code. You have to be careful because sometimes providers will put down, oh yeah, I did an intermediate repair, but then you look here and there's nothing to support an intermediate repair. It's supported maybe a simple, or he doesn't even tell you what layers he sutured closed. And without that documentation supporting what layers he was in, you can't support a layered closure. But in this case, he does say it's the left forearm. He did deeper wound closure to best approximate that. He did the subcutaneous tissue. He did the dermal layer here. So we have 2 different CPT codes because we cannot combine a simple repair and an intermediate repair, even though they were both the same anatomic location. These are 2 different repair types. One's simple and one is intermediate. So for our 2 centimeter simple repair of the forearm, we would use CPT code 12001. And for our intermediate repair, we would use 12031. You also have to be careful sometimes of your CCI edits. So I'm going to actually go on to, I use AAPC coder, and I want to check this out. If I put both these codes into AAPC coder, 12001 and 12031, okay, it doesn't say there's any CCI edits, so these would be fine to build together. You do have to be careful and watch for those CCI edits. In this case, if there are ones that you can unbundle, remember last week we talked about the 59 modifier and those X modifiers. So these might be an XS situation where it's a separate structure, or 59 depending on what your payer requirements are. The other thing I want to talk about are your wound dehiscences, which are when patient has sutures and they pop open. So there's a couple different codes for wound dehiscence. Code 12020 is for treatment of superficial wound dehiscence, so that's a simple closure. Or if you do packing, it's a 12021, and then if it's extensive or complicated, for a secondary wound closure, you would use 13160. So be mindful of those if there's any indication that the provider is doing a secondary suture or repairing a wound that has opened up, doing a second repair of those. So again, just make sure that the provider is giving that total final suture line, not just the size of the wound itself. So he has to have that total laceration repair size. Don't forget that you can combine the suturing of the same anatomic classification in CPT that are of the same type, meaning simple, intermediate, or repair. So if you have 5 intermediate repairs of the trunk, you can combine all of those to come up with a total size. You don't want to use 2 codes from the same type of complexity and the same anatomic location. Make sure you check those CCI edits. You can unbundle those if they are classified together in some cases. Don't forget to check your CCI edits, and remember, Check that CCI Edit policy manual we talked about in my modifier 59 videos, and if it's appropriate to unbundle, you can use your 59 or your XS for the separate structure. I really hope you liked this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a big ol' thumbs up. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any more episodes, and it helps support my channel and can support me in making more videos. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and keep on coding on.